Thank you so much. I'm Sonia Medina, the Executive Director of the Climate Program at the Children's Investment Fund Foundation, and I'm, for you today, the Speaker of the House. We're going to be debating a really interesting topic, a very, very live debate in the international aid community. The motion is the House believes that international aid should be used to promote donors' own national interest. And we have a great lineup of speakers for and against for the motion. For, we have Matthew Bishop, Senior Editor of the Economist Group, and Oley Dibba-Wadda, Executive Secretary of the Association for the Development of Education in Africa. And against, we have Pauline Rose, Director of the Research for Equitable Access and Learning Center at Cambridge University, and Hassan Aldami of Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So let's start with votes. You all have your sets. We're gonna vote first to see what is the baseline, and then we'll open the debate for and against. I will open up for questions at the end, some closing remarks, and then we'll see what the change of opinion has been on the House. A is if you are for the motion. B is that if you are against the motion. C if you are undecided. Please vote. Great. Can see. Is that B? B is. Okay, 18% are for, 67% are against, and 15% are undecided. The winner of the debate will be one that achieves the most swing in votes. That will be the rule. Wonderful. So let's start with a very timely and interesting debate. I'm first gonna invite our first speaker for the motion. Matthew, please. You have 7 minutes.
Okay, well, can you all hear me? So it's great to see a chart like that because it must be putting fear into the hearts of my opponents already that they know they have to maintain 2/3 of the support of the room on a debate that's actually not in their favor when you actually do the slightest bit of thinking about it. I can almost sit down now and leave it to them to lose their own arguments, but I won't do that. So. The letters OTT used to mean over the top. I'm told in Washington nowadays they refer to other than Trump because everyone is obsessed by this one conversation that everyone is. So the question would be in Washington, you greet someone and say, "How are things?" OTT before they launched into a big diatribe about how awful things are under Trump. I'm afraid that I am going to talk about Trump initially because with this topic, how could you not? The Trump view of aid is essentially it's giving money to bad hombres, to people who hate us, and that's a pretty stupid thing to do. Now, I think Trump is wrong in his general conclusion, which is to slash the American aid budget or propose that it be slashed. But I think he's wrong, not because I think he should be altruistic and have a view of aid that it's not about the interest of America, but I think that he misunderstands the national interests of America. Bill Gates said it very well. America, by cutting its foreign aid budget, will become less safe. That's something that the Pentagon understand. In America, they've long been supporters of foreign aid for that reason, that it's in the national security interests of America. And I think what I want to argue today is that actually, rather than getting hung up on what is motivating aid, is to accept that all international aid is essentially motivated by the national interest of the country, and they have to promote that national interest in order to achieve that national interest, as the motion implies. And let's actually have a debate about what actually these national interests really are, because I think the biggest problem in this area is that too many people, when they start talking about national interest with regard to international aid, revert to some kind of Trumpian view, which is, you know, it should be spent at home on building up bridges and things rather than given to these people that hate us abroad. So, briefly, I just want to turn the motion on the head. Imagine the motion we were talking about was, we believe that international aid should be used to promote interests against the country that gives the money, against the national interest. We would immediately vote against that. That would be absurd. What state could survive for long if it was spending money on things that were against its own interests? Secondly, you could say, well, there's aid that could be motivated by things in which the country had neither a for or against position in terms of its own interests. Again, what kind of policy in which a country has really no interest or is disinterested is likely to be well pursued? I would suggest that kind of policy pretty soon runs out of control and achieves nothing. This also applies actually at a personal level. If you think about personal philanthropists like Bill Gates, you would like to imagine him as a great altruist, but you look at Marcel Mauss's The Gift and his definition of altruism, and it turns out that to be a truly altruistic act, the beneficiary needs to be unaware that they've received a gift, and the giver needs to get nothing out of that gift, including even a momentary sense of pleasure or reward in their psychic reward zones of the brain. So essentially, even Bill Gates is getting satisfaction from achieving a high ROI in terms of his own convictions that all people are equal of value and that he wants to use his money to help improve as many lives as possible, and he gets a higher return on investment when he does that in the developing world. And that's an altruistic mission in a broad sense, but actually it's giving him a lot of happiness. He is getting a lot of reward from that, and that's really what's driving him to achieve his own mission. So why do I think it's important that we get away from this notion of international aid being altruistic? I think it's because we need to have a real debate about what self-interest is in this area. Those that have money need to understand, countries that have money, they need to understand that they have a huge opportunity to make the world safer and make their own people safer through very well executed international aid policies, policies that actually do achieve their enlightened self-interest. These are policies such as investing in the education of boys and particularly girls around the world, even when that's actually against the national policies sometimes of the governments, who they are, and the countries that they are trying to intervene in. I think that kind of clash of national interests is a good clash. If we were just being purely saying, well, I will go along with whatever the country we're aiding says is in our interests, in their interests, we would end up funding a lot of policies that actually didn't make the world a safer place and didn't achieve and promote the interests of the country giving the money. So let's have a real debate about what actually is the self-interested, enlightened self-interested agenda that a country should be pursuing. And then we would find that actually, rather than slashing the American foreign aid budget, there would be a really useful discussion that I think maybe the businessman in Trump might eventually come around to responding to, about how do you spend money really effectively in actually making the world a safer place if you were America? How do you really address the challenges that are out there in the world, whether they be climate change or alleviating poverty or empowering women? How do you do that effectively and in a way that really does make the world safer? And that debate is what is missing and what we should be having today, rather than arguing a rather pointless philosophical question about what motivates people. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to the losers of this debate in the hope that they can at least entertain us for the rest of the 45 minutes.
Thanks,
Thank you
Matthew.
very much.
Fantastic. Okay, can I invite Pauline Ross, who is our first speaker for the On Against.
So, first of all, thank you to all of you for supporting us from the outset, and I'm sure we're going to turn over the minds of those who are yet to be convinced. As any good politician, I did my homework by reading the newspapers. Unfortunately, I didn't have access to the Daily Mail. As those in the UK know, that is what influences any policy decision of anything, including, importantly, aid. But I did have the Daily Telegraph. And in the newspaper just a couple of days ago, I actually feel a bit bad about this. The whole debate shouldn't be about Trump, but there was a big headline that said, Trump budget slashes foreign spending. Now, I'm glad that this debate wasn't about whether we should be spending on aid or not. I imagine this room might have been 100% one way on that one. Interestingly, a small column on a sort of second page of the newspaper was about David Cameron, who is about to sort of set up a new commission on aid in the UK. One thing I feel quite proud about in the UK is that we do have the commitment of 0.7% of GMP, which is being upheld. Now, what David Cameron says quite clearly in this piece is about the fact that aid is in the moral interest. And that is what I believe in, and I believe it's important not only for the British government, but also for all those children around the world who are currently being denied a good quality of education. And that is what we should be focusing our minds on, how aid should be spent. It shouldn't be on whose interests it's in terms of the politics of this world, but on those children who are living in refugee camps, who are living in remote rural areas, who don't have access to a school or don't have access to good quality teachers who are enabling them to learn the basics. Now, if we do give aid that is in the national interest, this can actually be dangerous. And let's not be mistaken, the US has been given aid in the national interest for decades. It's not a new thing. Donald Trump might be saying it more explicitly. It's been happening. There's a great skewing of aid to countries that are seen as security risks. So Afghanistan gets funding from 20 donors. The Central African Republic gets funding from 6 donors. Afghanistan gets about $40 per child. The Central African Republic gets about $6 per child. That is because countries are currently giving aid in the national interest rather than to make sure those children who are living in conflict zones are getting the education that they need. Now, in a lot of countries, donor countries, part of the discussion now in the US and the UK and elsewhere, in Norway it's the same, is about education to fight extremism and giving men aid for this reason. To me, that's a dangerous argument because actually, as a researcher, it's very difficult to find evidence on whether there is a link between education and extremism. So if we go down that route, we might end up by saying, well, actually, the more educated people are potentially extremists, therefore we shouldn't be funding education at all. So actually, we shouldn't be using that as an argument. We need to be thinking about what the purpose of education is and how we can actually strengthen the minds and expand the minds of young people in a variety of ways, given that the vast majority of children and young people are not in any way going to be extremists. That's a dangerous argument to make, but unfortunately is often made by those who do argue about it in the national interest. Another thing that has already been happening, so again, not to sort of fool ourselves that this is a new debate, is that some donors give funding in their own national interests by funding scholarships for students to study in their own countries. So there are some donors well known for this, Germany, Canada, Japan, who give a large amount of aid to higher education for scholarships for people to come to their countries. Now, that aid is not reaching those poorest children in the Dadaab refugee camps in Kenya, in the slums of Nairobi, for example. This is only reaching those who are at the pinnacle of their education systems. In countries in Africa, fewer than 1% of the poorest children get access to higher education. Those children are not going to get these scholarships. So actually, we need to change the system as it is now to make sure aid is getting to those most marginalized children, to the children with disabilities. Why, if you were spending in your national interest, would anybody necessarily be thinking it was in their national interest to be giving children with disabilities, the pastoralist children who are living in remote rural areas, an education? But that is what I think needs to drive us as passionate educationalists, as people who really believe in the right to education, to make sure that we are doing the right thing. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Perfect. Can I then invite Oley to present further arguments on the foresight?
My right honourable friend just highlighted that aid is a moral interest of whom? Whose interest is aid in? I would want to argue, I'm sure you all are familiar with the old adage that he who pays the piper determines the tune. And I'll be speaking particularly from the African context and the example of aid not being, or being in the interest of the donor. I argue that naturally for any person or any individual, if I'm giving money, I have an interest. There is a reason why I'm giving money. And my friend here has argued that aid should be in the national interest for children, to benefit children. And she talked on education, which is exactly where I wanted her to go. Now, aid has been coming into Africa for the past 50 years. And it is being determined, it is being deliberately pointed out in what area. So if I have my money and I determine and I say, I want to support Malawi and I want to support, of course I'm going to say, I want it to focus on early childhood, or I want it to focus on, and today, of course, because it's being determined, or because it's whoever controls it or whoever butters the bread determines where it's going, education is fragmented in the continent. But there is an interest out. When we want to talk about funding aid in Africa, there is a resistance of, no, it has to come from out, we want to support, we want to help. I think it is time that countries, and I do agree, I'm not disputing what she's saying, but I'd also argue that it is time that countries start taking responsibility for their aid. Because what is happening is that it is being determined, it's being dictated, and it is in the interest of donors to ensure that they put systems in place, that they put mechanisms in place, because they feel there is corruption in Africa, because they feel that they need to manage governance issues, because they feel that, so if we allow that funds come in through for us, then we will have to control. I'll give the example of the African Union Commission. 75% of funds that manages the African Union is coming from foreign aid. And that covers the salaries of the chairperson. And of course, that would determine, there would be conditions attached to how those funds would be spent, at what time frame. So I argue that if we want to allow funding to go, or support to go into, aid to go into particular countries or particular continent, then of course we have to take the responsibility. There is a reality, a white elephant in the room that nobody wants to talk about. It is not necessarily, it's a marriage of convenience that usually one party benefits more than the other. And I think the reality is that we need to talk about the fact of the matter, that aid should be determined or be given to those who are actually putting money on the table. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Right, can I invite my honorable friend talking against the motion, Hassan?
Hello. So is the sound clear? Thanks very much. Well, thank you, Madam Chair. And I've got good news for you, ladies and gentlemen. Contrary to what you've heard, this is not a debate about Donald Trump. But you have good news for me. And I hope that the people who entered after the initial vote are as smart as the people who had entered before. You've got good news for me, which is that you understand, the majority of you, what this motion is really about. And you haven't been fooled and won't be fooled by an attempt to turn this motion into a hypothetical argument that is actually about whether doing the right thing is good for me. Look, of course we all believe that doing the right thing is good for us. That's not what this debate is about. And you know it, and that's why you voted and will continue to vote in your majority for aid not being about promoting the national interest. There are two key words in the motion, which, and I feel bad for the proposition, because it skewers them and it forces them to argue against something that they don't believe. These guys do not believe that the best way to do aid is to promote the national interest. And the two words that skewer them are should and promote. This debate is not, is aid done in the national interest? This debate is not, is selling aid as being in the national interest a good way to sell aid? Now, I don't want to cast aspersions on my boss, Bill Gates, but I do claim to know very well how he thinks. And I can tell you that the reason why he's selling aid as being in the national interest is because he believes passionately that it's incredibly important that we carry on spending money on aid. But I remind you, this debate is not about whether or not we should spend money on aid. This is about the how. This is about how you do aid. And I am proud to come from an organization where we're very clear about that, and we spend our lives trying to convince others in ways that sometimes cover up the way that we're really thinking about it, I admit. This is Chatham House rules, am I right?
I don't think so.
The truth is that what this debate is about is something incredibly important, because there are two camps when it comes to aid. There are two ways of thinking about aid that exist, that makes this debate meaningful, that I beg you to consider the debate in this way so that we can have a meaningful argument here and that you can come down on the right side. There is one way around doing aid, which is about promoting the interests of the donors, as said in the title. And there is another way of doing aid which focuses on helping the most people and helping the people who need the most help. And not using aid to promote the interests of the donors is about the latter, and that is what we must be focused on. Now, it's a shame that the world outside this debating chamber is not the world that we all want it to be. I cannot promise you that if you vote, that aid should be for the people who need it most and not to promote national interest. That when we leave this room, the world will change and that your vote will have changed the world. However, what I can promise you is here, in this room, you have the opportunity to send a message out to the world about what we think should happen and is right. Now, it's important to think about what's really at stake here. And like my compatriot in this debate, and unlike the other side, I've also done my research. It's easy for me, it happens to be my day job. Studies show that around 10 million people a year get lifted out of poverty due to aid. That's great. The same studies show that almost double that number, 19.2 million people, could be lifted out of poverty if aid was not dictated by the narrow political interests of donors. So if you vote for the other side, you're telling me that that's okay, that 9 million people every year can be left in poverty because what aid should be about is promoting the donor's interests. What promoting the donor's interests means is building a hospital that has the name of the donor on the door, but doesn't have staff that work in the hospital. We know this. I'm not the only person here who knows this. What promoting the donor's interests mean is sending aid, as was already pointed out, to countries that either don't need the aid or don't have the systems to make that aid well used, and avoiding sending monies to the nice, poor, well-governed countries that actually need and can use the money but aren't causing us a political bother or maybe haven't done us a political favor. That's what it means. What does it mean to do aid that's not in the national interests, that focuses on helping the people the most? I'll use here the analogy of a business. How do you make your business successful? You make your business successful by focusing on the client, on the consumer, on the person who uses your product. And that's how you make aid successful. You think about, okay, I know doing this is in my interest at the end of the day, but I will focus and I will concentrate on helping people because the world is unfair. And I was born into a wealthier country. And I didn't invent the contraptions that were invented in the 19th century in my country. I didn't create the empire that made my country wealthy. The world is unfair. And if we make the world a little bit fairer, people will be happier with the global system which privileges me and my country. So it's in my interests. But what do I focus on? I focus on helping the people who need it most. And how do I do that? I'll give you a very clear example. What's the opposite of building the hospital with the sign on the door? It's multilateral instruments where I, as a donor, pool my funding with other donors. I don't get my sign on the door. Things like Gavi, a vaccine alliance which has saved 7 million lives, founded by the Gates Foundation and other donors. It's not called the Gates Foundation Alliance. You probably didn't know it existed. You probably didn't know we fund it. It's not about the name. It's about saving 7 million lives. The Global Fund has saved 12 million lives. This is what aid is about. It's about pooling our resources, getting technocratic people, the best in the world, to decide on our behalf how to help people most, and to check in as donors to make sure our money's well spent. That is what aid is about. There are two camps in this debate, ladies and gentlemen, and I beg you to stay on the right side. This is not a theoretical debate about whether we can twist hoops around words and claim that doing what's right is also in our interest. Of course, doing what's right is in our interest. This is a debate about whether we should continue with a system, as Pauline set out, that is failing the poorest people in the world, or whether we should strive to build upon the things that work best, that are saving lives and pulling people out of poverty every day. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Great. So the House has now heard the arguments for and against the motion of whether international aid should be used to promote donors' own national interest. I'd like to open it for questions from the honorable ladies and gentlemen in the House today. Do you have any questions? Can I have my honorable gentleman there on the right-hand side?
Thank you very much. Thank you. The question I'm going to ask isn't the question I was coming here. I thought I was going to ask, but it was after the last intervention. And so it's to my friend from the Gates Foundation who just talked about pooled funds and the importance of pooled funds, and Gavi, and the fact that donors anonymously put resources into those. And that's been true in health, but it hasn't been true in the sector here in terms of foundation donors. So why do you think that is? Why do you think that is that the interests of some donors to want to have bilateral relations still in education, like Gates Foundation, is still outside of the pooled fund?
Can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, they said David Edwards, Education International. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
But I agree with the side, but I still want the question.
Thank you.
So basically the question is, why doesn't the Gates Foundation do more education? It's that is not the kind of question I was meant to be. I will answer it. But you'll forgive me if answering it in a politically sensitive way, especially in a room like this. You're absolutely right that there are a set of donors who focus on what has been proved to work best. When you vaccinate a child, it costs about $25. When you vaccinate 40 children from the least developed countries, one of those would have died and will no longer die, which means you save a life for $1,000. That's a great deal. To this day, we haven't yet got, and actually this is what Pauline works on, and she'll fix it very soon, I'm sure. We haven't yet got that level of clarity about what works and how much it works in education. And I think globally, that is the reason why there is less funding for education than for health, because there are donors out there who want to fund what works. Now, that doesn't mean that that it'll never happen on our side and that it doesn't happen already. Final point to make is there is something called the Global Partnership for Education, which is pooled funds, which has similar aims. So I wouldn't say I wouldn't paint it so black and white as health versus education.
Thank
I hope
you.
that helps.
Great.
Can I add a point?
Sure, Pauline, please.
So just to add a point, because I think, again, really the opposite side is actually in favour of our side of the motion. So Oley was arguing about the importance of actually supporting national governments and giving money through national governments. That is the moral thing to do. So that is very much our perspective. The countries that have benefited the most from aid are those where it has been pulled through sector-wide approaches. It's very sad, again, that we've been seeing a move away from that. But if we are doing the right thing, that is how we would do it. Thank you.
Can I invite my honourable friend to do a rebuttal quickly?
Yeah, three quick points. One is, there's nothing against your enlightened self-interest by putting morality as a motivation. America is supposedly a country built on values and ideas, the city on the hill. You would expect them to be moral and to spread a moral message to the world. So that's entirely in their self-interest to promote the value system that they are. Secondly, I've never thought that pooling with other people at a personal level is against my self-interest, doing things together. We often more than the sum of the parts. Likewise, pooling resources in something like Gavi or the Global Fund or all these multilateral institutions, that may be ultimately entirely in the enlightened self-interest of the donor country. And likewise, I think above all, if you are a donor that's acting in your self-interest, one of the things you really care about is value for money. So essentially, you want to use your aid money in a way that generates the highest positive benefit. And I would, for example, think that achieving the Sustainable Development Goals is in the self-interest, enlightened self-interest of every country, and investing in all the different mechanisms as effectively as possible to get there is the way to achieve that national self-interest.
Great. I'll go good. My gentleman friend, honorable friend there.
Thank you. Harry Petrinos, World Bank. I wanted to follow up on the last question. I didn't understand the answers because I'm happy to provide many investment opportunities in education that not only would give the clear rationale in terms of self-interest on both sides of our objectives in terms of improving education outcomes, improving the lives of poor people around the world, and that would be in the interests of every nation that provides foreign aid. So I would start with ECD. We know exactly what the benefits are in a variety of countries.
Can I ask you to be short on your question?
Yes.
What is the question,
My question
for the
is,
opponents? Or
what is the evidence base that's against focusing on education? Because we have clear evidence around the world, and I would point people to the Education Commission report.
Can you link your question to the motion of the House today? Should international aid represent further national donor interests, yes or no? What is your question related to the motion of today?
I think yes, definitely foreign aid should focus on issues that are of vital importance to the global community, and we have a clear evidence base.
Wonderful. So my honorable gentleman is for the motion. So can I have the honorable gentleman here on the first row on the left? He's not very honorable, according to his friends on the side. So can I ask, please, that the comments and the questions relate to the motion of today?
Absolutely.
And state clearly to whom it's addressed to?
Well, to both sides, really. Hassan, you said
Okay.
that the question today is how we do aid. I think it's really about why we do aid. So my question is, why do we think that national interests and doing the right thing are mutually exclusive and not possible together?
What's the question again?
I mean, why are the national interest and doing the right thing mutually exclusive?
Why are they mutually exclusive? Who wants to take the question? Pauline first.
I mean, I think I illustrated quite clearly that they are not the same thing, because if you were doing it in the national interest, you would do what is happening at the moment of giving money to countries that don't need the money the most, that, as has been happening also, has been skewing aid to actually funding refugee programs within Norway, within the UK, etc., rather than funding those who are living in the most dire circumstances, refugee camps in other countries. You would actually be channeling your money in different ways if you're doing it in the national interest or if you're thinking of it as a moral case. So. Well, we can debate the word moral and we can debate the word national.
Can I invite the rebuttal from the other side rather than from the questionnaire?
And I think that's how the other side have tried to skew the debate by really confusing how we are defining it. In my mind, it's quite clear.
But let's give an example. If I have money and I want to get something, I would decide what I want to do with it, and it's in my interest, isn't it? Isn't it? Sorry?
Okay.
Sorry. So I think donors. They're talking about my honourable friend has been talking about morally and in the interest. But of course, if a donor decides that they want to give money, they have to determine where that money wants to go, because they need to see what the returns in investment are for their taxpayers. So they would determine what whoever's putting money in the pot say, we want this kind of money. So.
Okay, the gentleman on the first row. Can I please ask, we want to get as many questions as possible to promote the debate, so you can really make up your mind whether you are for or against, or whether you are undecided at the end of the debate, which may be also an outcome. short and introduce yourself briefly.
Matthew Goldie-Scott of Carfax Education. Very briefly, Professor Rose spoke about the role of scholarships and suggested that scholarships are in the national interest of the donor. Does she not acknowledge the significant benefits they can bring in terms of raising opportunities for governance, sharing best practice and research, and also bringing together leaders from out the developing world to have discussions and bring benefits to their country? And does she suggest that that is mutually exclusive with also working to benefit the poorest?
Thank you very much. Professor Rose?
Thank you. That is an easy one to answer because I absolutely believe that scholarships are hugely important for countries that people are coming from and their economic development, etc. But the question is whether that should come from the aid budget. So most donors actually don't fund those scholarships through their aid budget. Those donors I mentioned previously do. So they might look like they're important donors in relation to aid, but actually that money is not being spent on aid that is understood in the definition of the OECD DAC, in the definition of how I, at least, and I think many in this room would understand what we're trying to promote through an aid budget. So it's not to say that's not important, it's about what budget it comes from.
Thank you very much. Can I just invite the last question from the honourable gentleman in the first row? Very briefly, we have only a minute and a half
Zaki
left.
Gori from Microsoft. When we are talking about aid, there is about $120 billion in the pool. There are 4 times are injected in the same pool yearly coming from private sector, mainly. The private sector is usually, they are after profit, but
we have 1 minute left. Can you use your question quickly?
But after that, they do have a say in what it is there. Countries, they do have the right to have a say, but what we need to debate is how we can partner together in order really to make sure that there is a safety net in order really to tackle the basic needs of some of the target groups.
Thank you. I'll take that as a comment. Thank you very much. Very good. Wonderful. Can I now then please invite for closing arguments on the fourth side? Who's going to make them? Matthew?
So we've been accused of twisting words and making this into a superficial debate, and yet they twisted the meaning of the word promote. I looked promote up on this internet thing that we have nowadays, and promote means to further the progress. This is according to the dictionary. If that's twisting words, I don't know what. Further the progress of something, especially a cause, venture, or aim, support, or actively encourage. How is that the superficial marketing of a nation that you're talking about? Promoting means helping to get the job done. Now, our argument on this side is that we stand at a very critical moment in international affairs. This is not just an arcane academic debate. At the moment, the biggest aid donor in the world is planning to basically withdraw from the international aid field on the basis that it doesn't want to give money to people that hate it. This is against the advice of its own military, and it's against the advice of every president of America that one can think of, going back to at least the early 20th century. And you know, in this context, you have to ask, you know, what can we do about this? How are we best going to change that debate, particularly when you look at the alternative view, which is that China is going to try and fill that vacuum, which is unambiguously motivated by national self-interest, and I think probably not a national self-interest definition that is based on several centuries of democratic debate and practice, and therefore is more likely to do repeat some of the mistakes that have been made by America in its less democratic and accountable moments. I think you look at the history of America, I think that international aid, the best moments were the Marshall Aid Plan to Europe, which after the Second World War, which basically revived Europe because America perceived it to be in the interest of America to have a non-fighting Europe, but a Europe that was based on prosperity and success and peace. The worst moments are when America has tried to win the rather difficult Cold War using foreign aid, because that was just a really unproductive and miserable kind of war. There was no vision there apart from survival in some sense. But I think now we're at this moment where the world has to decide, is it going to invest in the Sustainable Development Goals, creating a broad prosperity for all? And I think the only way we win that argument in America is to argue the self-interested argument that this is in America's best interests and the world's best interests, that those two things, doing the right thing, is highly aligned. Now, I think that nations are different to individual philanthropists. You know, so Bill Gates can decide to give all his money or most of his money overseas. We have to be interested in the real politique of aid. You know, if a president was to stand up and say, I'm going to give most of our tax revenues to foreign countries because there's an investment case for doing that, he might be right, but he wouldn't be in office for very long. But the fact is, very tiny, I'll finish, a very tiny part of America's budget has been going on international aid. Clearly more could be going if it was acting in its own self-interest, and at the moment it's going to go in the other way unless we can persuade this American government that they need to act in their own enlightened self-interest and increase their aid budget. Thank you.
Very good. Please, closing remarks on the against side.
Well, it may not have done me a great service to have argued against education aid in an education conference, but I'm going to take that as a point in favor of our argument, which is that the debate naturally shifted to the real meaty detail. Look, and maybe I'm wrong, and certainly I was only throwing out one side of the argument as to why there might be less health and education aid globally. But that's the point. We're now having a conversation about what works. We're now having a conversation in the audience about how is the best way to help people. And we'll all have opinions. The argument has been won. Now, you've been given two sets of arguments here. You've also been given two definitions of the problem. There are clearly two definitions of the problem, and one of them, by definition, would allow the proposition to win. I ask you to choose the definition of this problem that makes this debate meaningful, that allows you to choose between one side of a real debate that's going on in the world and another side of a real debate that's going on in the world. And one of the sides leads to more people dying, more people staying in poverty, and it's their side. This is not about whether we believe doing the right thing is in our interests. I doubt there'd be much of a debate if it was about. This is about the choice between going down a road that unfortunately the UK is saying that it will increasingly, that definitely the US is saying that it will increasingly, that many donors have been doing for years, as Pauline has expertly pointed out, and a different way that thankfully already exists. The UK, up until this point, has been really the best donor in the world of the nation donors at making the choice to put its money in pooled funds that really help people, in sending its money to the poorest countries in the world that need it most. And that's why the direction that they potentially will be going is one that causes concern. The US actually has never been a very good aid donor when it comes to picking its targets based on need. And the idea that the Marshall Plan is the best example of aid is the reason why we keep doing it wrong. Let's have a Marshall Plan for the Middle East. Let's have a Marshall Plan for the Central African Republic. Let's have a Marshall Plan. Let's have a Marshall Plan. This is not the most successful thing in aid. I'll repeat a statistic I gave you before. The Global Fund has saved 12 million lives, and it's done it in our lifetimes, not in our grandparents. And that's the kind of example we should be picking up on. There's a real irony in this debate. And the irony is that in many countries, people say that they're sick of aid because it's all wasted, and that people say that they're sick of aid because it should be more in the national interest. The irony is that the wasted aid is the aid that is spent, quote unquote, in the national interest, promoting the national interest. We can all go to the dictionary, but you know what this debate was really about. You know the debate that's going on in the newspapers every day about where aid should be spent and why. And I ask you to stick with that, stick with your beliefs, stick with us as you did at the beginning, and vote against this motion. Thank you.
Thank you, honorable gentlemen. Perfect. So this House has now heard the arguments for and against the motion. I'd like to invite the honorable ladies and gentlemen in this House to now make up their minds whether they are for or against the motion or continue to be undecided. I remind A is for, B is against, C undecided. Please vote. 15 seconds. So at the start of the debate, we had 18% of people for, 67% against, and 5% went undecided. We are now at 42% are for, 58% are against, and you have managed to convince everybody in this house either for or against. So, and I'd like to announce that my honorable friends on the for side win the debate. Thank you very much.